Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network invite you to discover your mission, a brand new in-depth monthly video series featuring engaging Catholic speakers who will challenge you to live your life abundantly. For only $25 a month, you will receive a personal monthly mission, including 3 full-length inspirational talks that build upon a new theme each month. Sign up for the Discover Your Mission tier at patreon.com/patchworkheartministry today.
Fiat Ministry Network and Patchwork Heart Ministry present Journeys in Faith. Now, here's Ann DeSantis.
Hi, good evening, and welcome to Journeys in Faith here on Fiat Ministry Network. I have an amazing guest for you on this evening. I have Julieanne Bartlett. She is the founder of Passion of Hope, and she offers a fresh perspective on singleness and the desire for marriage. So I would like to welcome Julieanne Bartlett. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Ann. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Yes, and you've also been a guest on my podcast, on the Sewing Home podcast with Bill Snyder and I, and we are grateful that you came and had that podcast with us. And yeah, this is going to be an amazing show for people to learn more about your ministry. They would go to passionofhope.com.
That's correct.
That's right. So let's start out with your own personal story. Go way back, right? Your faith journey.
Sure. Well, I think, I shared a little bit about this on the Sewing Hope podcast as well. But I was born and raised in the Catholic Church. And I had attended, CCD for like 8 years, basically the same amount of time that I was in, second grade through 8th grade. I had also attended public high school. I had begged my parents to send me to Catholic school, so they put me in Catholic high school. I, unfortunately, though, never really learned anything about the Catholic faith through those 8 years of probably 6 years of CCD and 4 years of Catholic high school. It was, through the 70s and into the 80s. And I was in an area where it was, very dry faith. And, we really weren't taught anything at all. It was very much like rote memorization of the Baltimore Catechism. And, to make our confirmation, we had to memorize like over 200, questions and answers from the Baltimore Catechism. That was all we had to do. And so, you just kind of went through it, got it done, did it, checked it off the list. And, it was kind of very sad when I look back at it. And then high school didn't really learn anything either, even though we had to take 4 years of religion. And I had a neighbor who I was, she was Presbyterian, but she really had a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I used to go over her house a lot and talk to her. And she would always make she was very much into scripture and into the Bible. And she would always make like these little scripture cards and gifts and things. And she would put like my name in the scripture cards to make it very personalized for me. And so I always wanted that relationship that she had with God. I just didn't know how to get it. And so when I was about 17 years old, I was like, I'm done going to church. I'm not doing this anymore. And I pretty much want to say that that's when I I didn't officially leave the Catholic Church at that point, but I stopped going. And throughout my 4 years of college, and then I had gone to law school. So I went like straight to law school from college, and that was 3 years. I didn't go to church at all. Like, I might have gone once or twice here or there with a friend or something, but I could count on one hand the times I went. And I just didn't practice my faith. And so after I had moved back home and taken the bar exam, and I was really starting to want a relationship. And so I ended up deciding to officially leave the Catholic Church and start going to what I call my journey in the evangelical world. For about 10 years I ended up going to a whole bunch of different non-denominational evangelical churches, from Pentecostal to various just Bible believing churches. And the reason that I had decided to leave the Catholic faith was because I just really wanted to know the truth about God. And I could not find it at that point in the Catholic Church. And I thought, I'm going to investigate this. And the people around me at that point in time seemed to be the people who weren't in the Catholic Church that seemed to know what was going on with God. So I ventured out into this journey, but then I never really stayed more than 2 years in a church, because everybody in these churches all seemed to hold a different opinion on the interpretation of the scriptures. And I was like, well, that doesn't seem to make sense to me, because there can't be all these different interpretations. Like, like for example, like like a big one was like the gift of tongues. Some were like, well, it exists now. No, it was only back, at the time of the apostles. And that was like a big contention, among some of these churches that I was in. So I'm like, well, there really can only be one answer, either exists now or it doesn't. And there were lots of other examples of things. And so for me, though, the big issue was, I was like, starting to move into like my late 20s. And, I always wanted to get married. I always struggled, with relationships, because I had a lot of trauma and abuse in my background. I have a mother wound, and I didn't really understand at that point in my life how much that was playing into my inability to, sustain a relationship or a healthy relationship that could, get to marriage. And so one of the issues that I was seeing is that, there were people who just met somebody and it went to marriage. And the churches I was in were like, well, those people are obviously called to marriage, and then people like me and other people who were similar to me who struggled to get married, they were like, well, obviously God called you to be single, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I was like, I could just never accept that. And it just didn't sit right with me. There was something inside of me, like, I already struggled with believing that God loved me. And I always felt like he loved other people better for various reasons, that had a lot to do with my background. And the singleness issue just compounded it. And like, why would God, single, no pun intended, me out to call me to like the singleness, despite everything in my being did not want it. And so I, was then venturing into my early 30s. And what had, transpired was that I was in my like early to mid 30s, and I had a relationship that seemed very hopeful that it was going to go to marriage. And for the first time, I really had a whole bunch of hope that was going to happen. And then when the relationship didn't work out, I was really like, one, kind of not so devastated that it didn't work out, because I was part of the decision of it not working out, but really kind of devastated with God. And I was like, I have to get to the bottom of this answer. Like, I have to figure this out. And that's kind of part of my personality. And I know that God's gifted me with those skills. Like I love problems and I love trying to figure them out. And I was like on this quest, and I spent like 3 weeks, I remember, on the internet. Like, this was back in like 2004. So I was like, I have to find, and I was not back in the Catholic Church at that time. Like, I have to find the answer to this. And there was like nothing. Everything that I searched was like, well, God calls you to be single. You can't do anything about it. And God calls some people to be single. And then towards the end of my 3 weeks, I found this like one article that was in ChristianityToday.com, which is a, like non-denominational Protestant periodical that was called A Singular Hope. And it was written by a woman named Kimberly Hartke, who's now a friend of mine, that she married at the age of 40. And she actually wrote that she was giving hope that you can get married. And so I reached out to her and had a conversation with her on the phone. And it turned out that she, lived in an area where I was going to visit in a month later. So we met in person. And in addition to that, she was not raised Catholic, but she had come into the Catholic Church. And I was like, oh no, like, I'm not going back to the Catholic Church. Like, and so that was like in February of 2000, actually February 2004. And in all of the little pieces of information she had given me about singleness that I pursued and trying to understand, she recommended that I look at Catholic writings, that the Catholic Church was very pro-marriage and everything. And looking at that to try to understand, like, I was so desperate for the truth that I was willing to look at anything about God and marriage to find some hope. So in doing that and looking at Catholic writings, it led to me looking further into the Catholic Church and researching like how Martin Luther had ended up splitting from the church, looking into the early church fathers and their writings, and some of them who had been mentored by the apostles, and going back into what early church worship had looked like and understanding all of that. And it was that Easter of 2004, I had this huge recognition that, the Catholic Church had the fullness of truth and was the true church. So it really was only like 3 months after I had met with her that I was like, I have to get back in the Catholic Church. So I had called a priest that was the priest at the church I had grown up in. Like, I didn't know him. He was, a newer priest. And because I had all my sacraments, I just really needed to go to confession, and I was right back in the Catholic Church. And so that was my kind of coming home story. And that with that settled, it on one hand, it was sad because I lost all of my friends from the evangelical world. Like, they disowned me, told me I was going to hell and everything. But it was very hopeful because it started me on my journey to get married. And I was, I didn't realize at that time I still had about 6 years ahead of me to meet my husband. But part of that was because I didn't realize at that time how much I still didn't know about the theology of how much God loved marriage. And I was still so wounded in not knowing how much God wanted something good for me. And marriage is good. God said that it's not good for a man to be alone. So when we're absent of that gift of marriage, I always believed he was holding something good from me. And I still struggle with that today. So, but that's a whole nother story. So.
Yes. You thank you so much for sharing. You do have an incredible story. Thank you for opening up your heart and sharing yourself with our audience. And so you give a lot of hope. And the name of your ministry is Passion of Hope, and it goes right along with your life. And you had a passion for hope not just for yourself, but also for others. So, and that's why you're doing the ministry that you're doing right now. So thank you. Before we go to our break, now we're not quite there yet. I thought you could tell us how you met your husband.
Sure. I was 42 at the time, and I had just moved to Maryland. I used to work for the federal government, and I just moved there to Maryland to take another job. And I was really kind of at the end of I always tell me I was really at the end of my rope. And and it was interesting. I always, because I'm very performance based. This is something that God's still working on me with, that believing that you can only earn love through your performance, which is so not the case with God. I always felt like I had to earn marriage, and that nobody could love me for me, and I had just moved to Maryland, and I don't think I had shared this part in the Sowing Hope podcast, but I had decided to just start praying the rosary for my husband, to meet my husband. And I was just going to pray the rosary as many times a day as I could. And some days I prayed it like 3 times a day. Sometimes days I just prayed it twice a day. Some days I managed to get it in 4 times a day. And so I started that like right before Lent had started, and it was 2010. I actually met my husband on a blind date the day after Easter. And so it was April 5th, and someone who had just moved to Maryland also who was friends with him said, I have this friend who lives in Texas, and I think you guys should meet. And so I think I had shared this, that, he had been divorced. And so I was very afraid of meeting him because I didn't want to date anyone who had been divorced, because I was scared of the annulment process. And because I would not marry someone who had not gotten an annulment. And but I agreed to meet him because I just felt like I didn't want her. She was not Catholic, and I didn't want to go through the explaining of the whole issue and everything. So I thought, well, I'll meet him. I had been on a number of blind dates before, and they never worked out. So I thought, well, the numbers of this working, the chances of this working out probably isn't very good anyway. So I won't have to go into any explanation. So I met him, and he was in town for a week, and we ended up going on like 3 dates for the week that he was in town. And he was getting ready to go back to Texas, and he had shared with me that he really saw this going somewhere. So I thought, well, I better kind of levy up at this point. So I explained to him that I was very Catholic, and that if he really saw it going somewhere before he invested time and money, that he might want to know that he's going to have to get his initial marriage annulled. And I really thought it would scare him away. And it didn't. And he was not Catholic at the time. He was an evangelical Christian. And so he went back to Texas, and he went to his local Catholic church and met with the priest there to find out all about annulments. And I think I had shared that we ended up getting his first marriage annulled within 2 weeks in the Catholic church.
Hi, my name is Ann DeSantis, and I'm the director for the St. Raymond Nonatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. You can learn about us on our website at nonatus.org. I'm here to tell you today about 2 great podcasts that I hope that you will tune in. The first Tuesday of every month at 8 o'clock, we have a podcast specifically for Catholics affected by divorce. From 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, go to Philly Nonatus on YouTube to subscribe. In addition, we also have a podcast the last Thursday of every month. That's also at 8 o'clock Eastern Time for 1 hour. And that one is for families in crisis. We have some really great guests coming up soon, so hope to see you then. Please also consider the fact that you can make spiritual direction appointments with us, with our spiritual moderator. All you need to do is go to our website on the contact form and just reach out to us. We'd be happy to hear from you and look forward to setting up an appointment.
So would love to connect with you. Please share this video and let people know that we're there for families affected by divorce and also families in crisis. Thank you.
Patchwork Heart Ministry and Fiat Ministry Network present the Discover Your Mission series.
Now, I had been brought up without any prayer, without Bible, without church, nothing of that kind. And so when my father died, I became suicidally depressed. I had no desire to live. And yet, by the grace of God, whenever I got to the point of actually taking my life, I always had this interior conviction that if I took my life, I would simply find it again on the other side, and it would be permanent misery.
But it wasn't until I became a wife and a mother, and I began to try and pass my faith on to my children, that I realized that everything I knew about Jesus was memorized doctrine.
I was a good man, I was a good father, I was instilling the sacraments into my family. I was definitely not intentional. I was stuck rope to my faith.
But what kind of strength did he have? Jackie did not just have a strength of body or baseball skill. He had a strength inside of his spirit, a courageous meekness that empowered him to play the game.
And I tell him what is going on with me, and he's like, oh, okay. And I'm like, no, I think this is like some sort of miracle, dude. And he's like, okay, of course, but I'll believe it when I see it. Honey, you've been trying to quit, and you've been saying this and saying that. And his big line to me is, you shouldn't say things because I never follow through on them. And so this was week after week, month after month. He is looking at me like, this is a miracle. There is no way that you, on your own, could have done this.
So we are called to sing. All of us are called to sing. All of us are called to express ourselves and join our voice into the unity of the church. Often with my choirs, I ask them to listen to each other, to listen to the sound that they make together as one. That's what we're aiming for. Through the harmony or unison, we're aiming for a one sound.
You need to decide, what are you going to participate in? Are you going to participate in the historic Christian idea of the altar of sacrifice, which is in the Eucharist, or not?
Hi, welcome back to Journeys in Faith here on this Friday evening. I have an amazing guest, as you learned during our first half of the show. I have Julieanne Bartlett. She is the founder of Passion of Hope Ministries. You can learn about it at passionofhope.com. And during the first half of the show, Julieanne told us about her own faith journey. And basically, she was experiencing something called prolonged singleness, but she had the desire for marriage. And that's what she talked about during the first half of the show, and told us how she met her husband, Seth. So during this half, I thought, Julieanne, tell us about Passion of Hope and how did it get started?
Sure. Well, I really felt the desire and that, that there needed to be a resource out there, that there was nothing in the Catholic Church that I could find, maybe there is and I just haven't seen it, that needed to speak to the, cohort of singles that are out there that desire marriage, but are unable to get there like I was. Because if it hadn't been for that article that I had found, I wouldn't have been able to find a stitch of hope. and for me, meeting Kimberly through that article and having gotten back into the Catholic Church, and then I was introduced to another woman because she kind of mentored a group of women in her area and helped, maybe a dozen or so women get to marriage. And she doesn't do that anymore. But through her and this other woman I'd met, I had two mentors. And so I felt like kind of, like in Titus, the book of Titus, it says the older women should mentor the younger women to be, how to be good wives and everything. And I thought, well, we live in a generation now or a time where we're seeing things I don't think we've seen before, and prolonged singleness in the masses, to me, is a modern phenomenon where people are just not marrying. And I was able to locate a 2014 study that's on the United States Catholic Conference or Conference of Catholic Bishops that shows that over 40% of Catholic singles or Catholic people are not married, that they're single. And that's huge. That's that's following not far behind from the actual, world statistics for the United States, which is over 50%. So not only in the divorce statistics, but in the not married statistics, is the church following not far behind for the world. And we're supposed to be set apart from the world. And we're supposed to be leading the way, because we're the church. And so I thought, there needs to be something out there to help people. I wanted to create something that I wished had been there for like when I was single. And so I thought, let me do that. And so that was kind of the genius, for lack of a better word, behind Passion of Hope. And so I think the two things that need to, be learned by people, which was, are part of one of the resources that I'm doing, which is putting a blog post out there on my website, in addition to me trying to, do podcasts. Like I'm, was on your podcast. I've been a guest on several other podcasts. I'm also writing, or trying to get published in various periodicals. I'm an author at Catholic Match, the dating website. I just had an article published in Crisis Magazine. So I'm trying to, get information out there, because I believe the people who are really hungry for it will, receive the information that, God's trying to pour into them. It's twofold. It's receiving the theology of how much God loves marriage, and that there is a universal call to marriage. And I'll, share that in a moment. And then there's also things I think that we have to do to work on ourselves, to work on the things that are preventing us from getting to marriage. And so it's this twofold, process. And I had to do that myself, like change certain behaviors that, were hurting me, and then also believe that God wanted it for me, so that I was able to pray for it.
Yeah, I love your perseverance through all of it, because you weren't sure on your own end when you were single for a while what direction your life was going to go in. But God had other plans, and not only plans for you to meet Seth and get married, but also for this ministry. Now, I know that there's also a story related to Seth, because I happen to be the director for a foundation called the St. Raymond Donatus Foundation. You know about that.
Yes.
And that we make outreach to Catholics who are affected by divorce and separation. And I know that there's a story about that regarding Seth, because he also experienced that prolonged singleness, but maybe not the way that you did. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So my husband, I'd shared before, was divorced. He had married at the age of 19. He married his high school sweetheart. They got married, very, early in life. And he was married, I want to say for about just under 10 years. And so they weren't married. I want to say they were married for 10 years, but they were separated for part of that time. And so they, had gotten a divorce, and then he was single, so he was about 29, and we got married when he was 40. So he experienced what, I like to call secondary prolonged singleness. And I believe that there's a lot of people similar to him that are out there as well, whether it's from divorce or maybe they've been widowed, or a widower, and maybe married young, or maybe even married like later in life, like I did, but then their spouse, or they, passes away, or they go through a divorce, and it's later on in life, like in their 50s or 60s, experience, the loss of a spouse, and struggling. And I believe that, some people choose not to marry again, but other people want to marry again. And so, having to step into the throes of the dating world is really difficult, and it's painful. And so my husband really thought he was, he jokes about it. He thinks, he was going to become like the crazy cat guy, because he had 2 cats, which he brought into our marriage. And so he, he really didn't think that he was going to find somebody. And so he, was very grateful, for himself that, he finally, did too. And part of why it was, I'll just share too, that we were, for anyone who's hesitant or afraid to, like myself, of the annulment process, I had actually, when I first met him, I went to see the priest that I was at the church that I used to go to mass on the government base that I was working at, and I would talk to the priest there at the chapel. And I said, should I just end this with him, since he's divorced and I'm dating him? And the priest had said, no, don't end this. He's like, let's see what God is doing in your life through it. And so it turned out that his first wife was Catholic, like was born and baptized and raised Catholic, and her family had left the church, and they were married outside of the Catholic Church. So that's why we were able to get an annulment within 2 weeks, because they did not have the proper form, the ecclesiastical form. Yeah.
Interesting. But isn't it also very wonderful and interesting that God brought the two of you together, and you had both experienced that prolonged singleness in different ways?
Yes. But he had the secondary, what I call secondary prolonged singleness. And, I had never been married. So
that's right. But God had other plans. Now, we're coming a little bit close to the end of the program, but I wondered if you could share with us, if somebody's watching and they are experienced what you did for a long time, meaning that, maybe they have that desire that they'd like to get married, but they've been single for quite a while. What kind of hope could you give them? And are there any resources that they can find on either on your website or other places?
Sure. On my website, I have a free ebook. It's 10 pages, and they can go there and they can download that. It's very similar to something I had actually wished was available when I was single. It's kind of like a starter kit, I consider. It has scriptures and quotes from the Catholic Catechism and some journal prompts. I think it's a good place to start. And there's also a resource page, and on there I have some links to other books, which they're not Catholic, but they were books that I read while I was Catholic and before I came back into the Catholic Church, that I thought were very helpful in they point to scripture, and they're, I don't think they contain the fullness of truth on, God's desire to help people get married, but I think they are a good starting place. Obviously, I'm putting together a book proposal to try to get a book published on, what I believe is the fullness of theology on, God wanting to help people get married. But I think these are great places to start. And Catholic Match has a lot of great resources there on their blog post and everything, to encourage people to get married as well.
Yeah, awesome. You have a really good website, and I love your ministry. I just want to invite people too, that if they have not listened to the podcast that you did with Bill and I, Bill
Yes.
Snyder, to go to Patchwork Heart Ministry YouTube and look up Julieanne Bartlett, because it was a great podcast. And, when you interview people and you compare two interviews, there's always going to be some things that people share in one interview that they didn't share in another. So I just want to encourage you to go ahead and do that. And also, I have an invitation for when this show is over for everybody who's watching, is you can go to our Patreon site. It's patreon.com/Patchwork Heart Ministry. And there's going to be a show there called 5 Minutes of Faith. And you can learn a little more about Julieanne and what she does. So do check it out sometime after the show. One thing I wanted to talk about before we end, Julieanne, was what about prayer? Now, I know that you prayed a lot and God did answer your prayers in that special way. Is there a certain way that people can pray that can help along whatever it is that God's will is for their lives?
Yeah, I encourage people to pray the rosary. I really do, for marriage. And that's for two reasons. I believe that, Sister Lucia told us that the battle at the end times, the final battle between God and Satan, was going to be the battle over marriage and the family. And I believe that includes the battle to get married. And so I believe that the rosary is a great weapon to help people in that battle. And also, I feel that the Blessed Mother has a heart for people to get married, because even though we always focus on her virginity, like her perpetual virginity, which is absolutely true, that she's also a spouse. She is the spouse of the Holy Spirit. And so she has a soft spot in her heart for people to want to be spouses. And so I believe that's why when I was praying the rosary, that, that's the prayers that were answered, because I had done a whole bunch of novenas to different people. Like nothing seemed to work for me, but the rosary worked.
Yeah, I love the rosary, and I can't recommend it enough to everyone. And spending that day, even if just 5-10 minutes in meditation. So yeah, that's beautiful. So we do have to end, unfortunately. Julieanne, you have to come back at some point. Do you have any final words before we end?
I just encourage people to have hope that, there's, a universal call to marriage, and, that God has not singled you out to be single unless, there's a religious vocation. So
that's right. Thank you so much. Please do come back again, and we will see all of you here next week on Journeys in Faith. God bless.
Journeys of Faith is a production of Fiat Ministry Network and Patchwork Heart Ministry. For more information about Journeys of Faith, email info@fiatministrynetwork.tv. And be sure to friend, follow, and like us on social media. Just search Journeys in Faith with Ann DeSantis.